been a while since I've posted anything. A few months ago, I became deeply aware of my disconnection to God. So I deleted all my social media to give myself the opportunity to see if I could repair that connection. After being an adamant atheist for 14 years and finding myself hopelessly depressed, nihilistic, and without any real purpose beyond the extent of my own subjective reasoning, I wanted to see for myself if I could, in fact, pursue a real connection with a real God. I wanted to see what that looks like, feels like, or if it's even possible. And I didn't want anyone else to dissuade, discourage, or poison such a sincere pursuit for me. I do have a relationship with God now, but it's not the one that a 6-year-old imagines. God isn't a sky fairy that you treat like a gumball machine, say a half hearted prayer, cross your fingers, and get what you want. That's not how this works. In my experience, a relationship with God often starts with a better relationship with yourself. We are his temple, after all. It is, in fact, a deeply introspective journey. Even in the book of Genesis, it's written that we are made in God's image. And although this may be too abstract for someone of more skeptical or materialist disposition to appreciate, in many ways, I often feel like we're all thought forms in the mind of the Creator experiencing himself. Soren Kierkegaard, who was the father of existentialism and also was a devoutly Christian man, really interesting guy, and he had a particularly interesting thing to say about prayer. Kierkegaard said that the function of prayer is not to influence God, but rather to change the nature of the one who prays. There is a lot of depth in this line of thinking, as it's written in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8, that God is the same today, yesterday, and forever. So it's not us who influences God to change or work for us, but rather by sincerely and humbly seeking Him from within, we become and change into the type of person that is in alignment with God, who he will bless. This has been an intense couple of months for me, even though nobody has seen it. I've been voraciously pouring through scripture, reading philosophy books, spending time in nature, praying, and writing and thinking a lot. It's been a great opportunity to develop at least a slightly more sophisticated understanding of theology as well. Because before this period of time, and despite the fact that I did in fact grow up believing in God, my understanding of the Bible was honestly like a 10-year-old's, and that's why I could never really appreciate it. Although there is much valid historicity in both the Old and the New Testament that corroborates with non Judean or Christian texts from the same periods of time, I think when reading the Bible only from the perspective of an uncompromising literalist, you'll end up overlooking a lot of the deeper truths and allegories contained in it. For example, the word Adam in Old Hebrew literally means dust. In ancient Greek, the word Adam is actually a generic word for man or mankind. I think that learning to understand theology on its more symbolic level rather than the children's stories the Bible is often parroted as has actually allowed me to reconcile much of what science has revealed about the natural world too, namely biological evolution. I think Christians who are passionately compelled to continuously misunderstand and misrepresent evolution, refute the known age of the earth or the age of the universe, really just back themselves into a corner at this point, and it makes Christianity as a whole look bad. This absolutely shattered my faith when I was younger because I was only exposed to a certain community of Christians who refused to accept things we just know to be true, confirmed by physical evidence. But whether you're a young earth creationist or an atheist, there's actually nothing about an old universe or biological evolution that suggests even one thing that's biblically incompatible. In the Garden of Eden story, there was not only the tree of knowledge, but there was also the tree of life. Why would there be a tree of life if mortality hadn't already existed in the world? In Genesis, it does say that there was darkness before light. Although most people tend to think of this as a reference to the sun, it could be symbolism to suggest that there was, in fact, death before the fall as well. I absolutely believe that there was death before man's nature became perverted and corrupt. Humans share 98% common DNA with chimpanzees as well, so the 2% difference that makes us so vastly different is not our physical or tangible features, but I think rather the human soul itself. When God breathed life into Adam after he was dust, I personally believe that it's the rational human soul that Scripture is probably symbolically referencing. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, it's written, "With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." So, interpreting the creation story of Genesis in the light that it literally took God 6 days to create the world, and on the seventh day he needed to physically rest because all powerful God was tired, is likely a childish and amateur misinterpretation of Scripture. One thing's for sure, there's far more depth in symbolism in Christianity than I ever realized or could appreciate in my younger years. Although I can see a lot of depth and truth in it now, this video is not intended to necessarily be an argument for Christianity or even proof of God's existence, but rather just a telescope into the depths of my own mind and an honest and transparent discussion about the hidden motives and shortcomings in my old way of thinking, as well as some insight on how I became an atheist and why I no longer am. When I was 14, I decided that I no longer believed in God. There was, of course, a rise of cultural atheism in the mid to late 2000s that gripped my young and impressionable mind by force. In retrospect, this movement does seem to correlate all too eerily with the cultural directives of the principalities of ivory tower society, who've done their best to convince us for the last several decades that if it doesn't bend the knee to the almighty God of GDP, then it simply doesn't have any value. Not a nation, not a culture, not a family, not a God. Because life is meaningless and we are supremely educated and sophisticated humans living in a highly evolved technocratic society that no longer need petty connections to our higher power or something greater to live for, our primary goal should be to maximize production and consumption for the benefit of corporations. In between the hours, we're not having our soul sucked dry by meaningless repetitive tasks. We should be numbing ourselves as much as possible with cheap entertainment and hedonistic pleasure. This is the West's new secular religion, complete with its own doctrine, ideals, sins, sainthood, and demons. But the ultimate human good under this worldview is just a more equal sharing of material comfort. It is completely devoid of any higher transcendental human ideals. So it's not hard to see why it's pushed so heavily by banks and corporations. It does make sense for an economic system which seeks to facilitate maximum production and consumption. Because all human effort will be directed into this enterprise, all spirituality is to be crushed and replaced with the endless drive of the individual to produce and consume. Nothing immaterial is held as valuable or even conceptualized. If it can't be put on a graph, then it simply doesn't matter. I spent hours watching YouTube videos and joining Facebook groups criticizing religion and religiously adulating science. I soon found myself very sympathetic to thinkers like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Penn Jillette. I found their irreverent attacks on faith in God and religion to be both fascinating and compelling. Of course, I was also influenced by the opinions of many of my friends and other cultural figures like George Carlin. When I heard him joke about how people have been actually convinced that there's an invisible man living in the sky who watches everything you do every minute of every day, and the invisible man has a special list of 10 things he does not want you to do, and if you do any of these things, then the invisible man is a special place full of fire and anguish where he will send you to suffer and burn and choke and scream and cry forever and ever until the end of time. But he loves you. He loves you and he needs money. He always needs money. He's all powerful, all knowing, all wise, but somehow just can't handle money. When I heard him grossly misrepresent what belief in God actually means, I was actually convinced that this is where my exploration of this topic started and ended. Of course, it never occurred to me that letting the jokes of a comedian influence my views on something as serious as God really meant that I wasn't actually just very developed or mature, let alone a serious or sophisticated thinker. But my 17-year-old self never realized that because I had already heard what I thought were some pretty good arguments and I already knew everything. It didn't help that the average Christian or person I knew who believed in God were not particularly critical or intellectual thinkers either, so it was all too easy for me to make the faulty assumption that anyone who believes in God is just a stupid moralist living in the past who couldn't possibly cope with the harshest truths of reality, while thinkers of a more rational disposition were capable of actually scoring triple digits on an IQ test. I maintained this view for 14 years. As time went on and my ability to reason became more mature and sophisticated, alongside developing a more precise scientific understanding of the world, it's no surprise that my nihilism grew in direct proportion to my adamant disbelief in anything else. I couldn't possibly take seriously the need for religion and laughed at the idea of God because I was the recipient of a supremely technological age. I had many gadgets and conveniences that were afforded to me by scientific discovery and invention, and I certainly wasn't willing to give those things up in favor of something I didn't understand and couldn't even see. In fact, we know more about the universe now than we ever have before. We have greater technical expertise than we've ever had. We have more opportunities for education than we've ever had at any time in any era of history. As our natural knowledge of science and technology has grown, our willingness to engage in discourse with ideas outside a narrow range of specifically tailored technical claims has been utterly shattered. Now, I had a profound spiritual experience back in early January that shook me to my core and had me question everything I once thought I was so sure about. But that's not something I intend on talking about in depth today because, as a previous skeptic and nihilist myself, I know all too well the reality that I can never convince anyone so puffed up by certainty to change their mind by my own personal revelation. While major shifts in worldviews of this nature are inherently complex and rarely boil down to just one overarching idea, there is indeed one major flaw that I eventually stumbled upon in my old atheistic worldview. I remember watching a particular interesting debate between a panel of atheists and religious thinkers on YouTube about 10 years ago or so. I can't even remember exactly who all was there, but I never forgot one particular thing that was said because I've used it myself in arguments many times. When confronted with necessary but non physical or scientific questions about the universe, others seem to embrace a more honest nihilism and deep skepticism towards things that couldn't be asserted with pure certainty. But the final straw for me was when one atheist openly admitted his own methodology for discerning truth about the universe under a not so subtle process of equivocation. He said, questions that are intractable for the tools of science to understand are not actually questions worth answering because they cannot be validly given answers that are empirical in nature. This statement was so profound in revealing the process of how an atheist or scientific materialist discerns what is true about the universe, but I didn't have the capacity or wisdom to realize it at the time. No, it took me almost 15 years, a literal spiritual experience, in learning that I could understand objective truth about the universe from other reference points, where I finally realized and could begin to articulate the fundamental flaw in this way of thinking. And that is that an atheistic worldview completely rejects all past forms of human knowledge and understanding as only being driven by dogma or superstition. If it was before the Enlightenment, it's meaningless because we didn't actually know anything about the world. This is an incredibly arrogant and short-sighted way of thinking because when I read Paul's epistles or ancient Greek pre-Christian philosophers like Socrates or Plato, it's very evident to me that ancient philosophers and even deeply religious thinkers had a much broader and more intuitive understanding of the world and our place in it that far predated the scientific method. Moreover, the scientific method is a very confident but narrow way of understanding the natural world only. Because scientific questions are only capable of answering what is material or observable, it's had supreme confidence built into it, not as a bug, but as a feature. When stacked alongside more abstract ways of understanding the world, the inherent objectivity and confidence of science was much more attractive and reassuring to my younger mind, and I was very ready to reject anything that wasn't immediately confirmed by an algorithm. But the reality is that throughout the course of human history, man has developed many methods of understanding and relating to the world around him, such as virtue ethics, heuristics, mathematics, aesthetics, proto-science, and religion. He's asked philosophically deep, important questions like, what is beauty? Or what is right and wrong? Or is there meaning to life? These are not scientific questions with succinctly scientific answers, and neither are any questions about God. But just because science is completely incapable of answering these set of questions doesn't remove the need or importance to answer them. But if you live your entire life viewing the importance of philosophical questions only through the narrow scope of scientific understanding, then philosophical questions of more abstract, intuitive, or poetic nature will just get tossed aside or rejected completely. Because the vast majority of Christians, or even people who say they just simply believe in God, are not highly educated theologians and rather just normal people likely following a tradition they were born into, who only tend to understand the faith in its most superficial expressions, ridiculing their worldview under the glaring eye of remorseless scrutiny was a rather simple task for me to accomplish. I took great pride in crushing the hopes of others in an effort to vainly raise my own perceived level of intellectual positioning. When people asked me what I thought about religion, spirituality, God, or other less immediately tangible ways of understanding the world, I would confidently assert that I couldn't possibly take seriously the perspectives of primitive sand dwellers who didn't even know what gravity was, or that the earth revolved around the sun. I would assert emphatically that I was an exceedingly rational person who only followed the evidence, that I did not hold any views that weren't explicitly confirmed by science, that I merely observed the universe and acted accordingly. This hubristic and short-sighted pretentiousness of dishonestly reframing questions of non-scientific nature and then saying, "Where's the evidence? Show me the evidence," is precisely what allowed me to theoretically always win that argument, at least in my own head. I finally understood that it was specifically this approach that allowed me to prop myself up as the scion of all human knowledge, which gave me a great deal of self-esteem, as I constantly assured myself how much smarter I was than other people who believed in the fairy tales of the antiquated past. Although I claimed to be genuinely interested in seeking the truth, I was really only interested in appearing more intelligent than people who I believed were holding society back, and thus were inferior to me. I never would have admitted that I was in fact holding a worldview that was as condescending as it was self-serving. When only viewing life through the lens of scientific materialism, you can only end up with a nihilistic worldview. One method, one endgame. If this is in fact the only method you use to understand the universe or find meaning in it, you won't find any. I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it's impossible to find any meaning whatsoever in this, beyond the subjective meaning you want to give things, which usually just means living your life as an ultra self-centered hedonistic pursuit because nothing really matters. Nothing has any objective or intrinsic value, including other people. There is no real meaning to life, and you will die. Under this worldview, you will spend years, even decades, distracting yourself with empty and vain surrogate activities in an attempt to quell your mind from experiencing the existential dread of the abyss you've staked your home in. You will live in cognitive dissonance as you attempt to identify your nihilism as a sign of intellectual prowess or maturity, while losing all hope, inspiration, and genuine curiosity as you degenerate into someone that seeks pleasure in vanity as your highest pursuit in between hours of boredom and self-loathing. I unsuccessfully tried many times to reframe and rebrand my way of thinking as a sort of optimistic nihilism, as in, well, life is pretty meaningless, but that's okay because somebody else has it worse than me. Sometimes this would work for a while, but I could never escape the reality that I was only trying to presuppose whatever it was I was trying to prove because I was only living for myself. Allow me to propose a more enriching perspective. There's an old Yiddish joke where a man lost his keys and is on his hands and knees searching for them in the streetlight. Another man walks up and asks him what he's doing, and the first man replies, "I lost my keys in the dark and I'm trying to find them." The second man replies, "If you lost them in the dark, then why are you looking for them under the streetlight?" The first man responds, "Because it's the only place I can see." The easy way of searching for God is not always the best. Sometimes we must take a leap of faith and plunge into the minds of our ancestors who understood the world in ways that we could never comprehend under the comfort of the illuminating but narrow streetlight that the modern world provides. You have to be brave enough to resist the temptation to believe that you are regressing and be prepared to give up the comfort and perceived certainty of modernity in a sincere effort to broaden your understanding of reality that exists beyond the streetlight. Because once the lights are dimmed enough, do we not see a different kind of light appearing in the distance? Do we not start to see aspects of the night sky that were once totally invisible to us under artificial light? Perhaps when we're brave enough to do this, only then will we start to understand that many of the things we once so arrogantly labeled as non-existent in the past are now staring back at us, face to face. In any case, I'm glad that I've had a genuine experience in subsequent awakening. I'm glad that I know that the personal God does in fact exist. As my good friend Michelle put it, lots of people go through their whole lives cynical and unfulfilled. I think that if you genuinely want to know the truth and earnestly seek it, you will find it. Jesus himself said, "Ask and you shall receive. Seek and ye shall find. Knock and the door will open unto you." Maybe there is a sort of divine wisdom in those words, because it was specifically in this order that God did reveal himself to me. Ask, seek, knock. But it's not something anybody else can say or do for you. Nobody's going to hold your hand, and you can only experience this if you truly seek it with all your heart. As I said before, the pursuit of knowing God is a deeply personal journey where one becomes so deeply introspective in a quiet place of meditation that they can actually hear the voice of our Creator. And this isn't the voice of your own inner monologue or conscience, but rather an unmistakably separate voice. But in the busy and increasingly noisy world of modernity, where we are constantly tempted with endless entertainment, distractions, and vice, it's no wonder most people never hear the voice of God, let alone perceive his presence. I never would have believed I could know God until I finally took the plunge to see what that might be like. And I do feel a spiritual renewal and a sense of hope that I haven't felt in a very long time. There is a reason why the principalities of high society never want you to hear the voice of this very real and personal God, because there's great power in it, and they both fear and hate that. If you're discouraged to explore your relationship with God because it sounds too abstract or difficult, or you're worried about what your friends or other people who are absolutely miserable might think, take solace in knowing that the one who lived a perfect life and indiscriminately loved everyone was still persecuted and killed. And he said, "If the world hates you, understand that they hated me first." Don't let the noise of the world and your own self-serving pride convince you that God's voice can never be heard. And don't mistake religious fundamentalism for a real and personal relationship with God. Although pop Christianity and many surface-level modern Protestant churches constantly misrepresent what Jesus actually taught, don't forget that it was freedom from religious fundamentalism. That's why the Pharisees and self-righteous religious leaders of his time wanted him dead. They taught fire and brimstone of the Mosaic law, and he taught everlasting grace, forgiveness, and regeneration of spirit. So if you still find this all a bit too abstract or confused as to what it's really about, let me simply leave you with this. The Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the Romans, "Do not conform to this world, but instead be transformed by the renewal of your mind." Amen.